can eat the amount of grape solids that displace a review of wine. Unfortunately, that student ended up going to YU in the belief that this is what shear was like at Yeshiva University. And 3 years later, it came to me plaintively saying, there aren't enough shining examples. When we do it, it's too often in the context of something like a special program. This week, we will integrate your... what needs, I think, to be done is the faculty genuinely need to be learning that way. And if you can create professional development which excites faculty about what I learned Torah better this week because I understood something else, then that will mamela get transmitted to the kids. And then eventually you can plan a genuinely integrated curriculum, which I think is the ideal. But until then, the faculty need to be learners that model it for the students, or else it's a shtick.
But I don't think that you should belittle that electricity week or something like that, because if you can ignite the imagination of the student, even if the teachers aren't up to doing this all the time, again, from the lifelong learning thing, and even your student who was disappointed at the shear, but he knows what a shear can be, well, let him take the ball and run with it. And so that's really, I think, what the game is. Not to create learning experiences that are essentially dull and essentially meaningless and do not relate to students, but to give them things that will ignite their imaginations and show them what's possible. And they have to do some of the heavy lifting also. I don't think it's all... ideally, yes, we would have... I spoke once to Donnie Sperber many years ago. I asked him, the kind of school I want every faculty member to teach on both sides of the curriculum. And he says, where are you going to find that? How are you going to find people who are on the same page? How are you going to find people, just be realistic. And so I think that, unfortunately, that is a realistic idea. But that doesn't mean that we can't take the resources that we have, and by mixing and matching and being outside of the box a little bit, give our students exciting experiences.
Just one question. It seems that a lot of these answers that we were discussed today were really for very precocious children, children that are very smart, very intelligent, ask very interesting questions. But what about teaching children that aren't as precocious and inspiring them for meaningful life in Yadus? And how do you do that for them?
Obviously, just like one size doesn't fit all as far as schools are concerned, that's also the truly gifted teacher presents, well, it depends on what kind of class you have. If you have homogeneous grouping or heterogeneous grouping, it depends on who's making up the class, whether there is mainstreaming, whether, there are lots of variables. Assuming that someone has a class of mixed skills, a skilled teacher will present the same material on many, many different levels. That's the whole multiple intelligences idea, that you realize that not everyone is going to get everything the same way. And what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to engineer. A gifted teacher just does it naturally. It just comes instinctively. So some others, we have to think of it very self-consciously as to how can I design this so that the maximum number of students in the class will relate to it and will be able to connect to it. And that's a lot of work, but the individualization that's required in order to reach as many students as possible, I don't think it's always possible to reach every single student, but it's possible that if one class I don't and another class I do, or I will focus on that group the next time to make sure that they also have a meaningful kind of experience. So it's about knowing your students, knowing your skill set, knowing the kinds of things that you can do in order to engage them. Obviously, if you're going to approach the material the same way every single day, day in and day out, that's a guarantee that there might be some students who will learn despite you because, they want to learn, and it just, even though you're trying to bore them to death, they just won't let you. But there are lots of other students that you really have to work hard to engage. But that's the job. That's, if someone isn't ready to do that, so they're in the wrong profession. You have to find people who are ready to engage, who are ready to, try to develop their own skills to be able to maximize the experience of all of the students in their classroom.
Simple question. A lot of parents ask, how are we going to pay for this? As educators, what are some of the areas or questions that you would ask that we as a community to explore to be able to answer that question as we try to improve the education year after year, make it essentially more expensive?
Well, I think first of all, it's really important to try to maximize resources. I was working on a project in Hamilton, Ontario, with the Lookstein Center a couple of years ago, where it's not a very large community, and there's an Orthodox school, and then there's a fledgling community school, and they were working on creating a middle school together, which means that they would have general studies program together, and then Judaic studies, they would have tracks, and therefore families would not feel compromised that they would have to take Judaic studies in a context that they didn't want. Of course, the devil's in the details. How do you really work that out? And, you know, the length of the day and dress code and all sorts of things. But I think it's time to be creative. I mean, there was just an article in the New York Jewish Week that says that funders are now more interested in informal Jewish education than they are in day schools. Many years ago in the Jerusalem Fellows, Seymour Fox said to us that at that point, this was in the middle 80s, you know, day schools are getting the attention of funders, but it's a mixed blessing. It's a double-edged sword, because let's say they become disillusioned. You know, right now, they're going to invest, and there has been a tremendous investment in day schools by federations, by funders, etc. And now they're going to look at the results. And if they feel, you know what, this isn't where we should be investing our money, we have to be investing somewhere else, so the same interest that got people very excited, that can now shift into a different area. I personally believe that the way that day schools will be funded, etc., is if they are maximally excellent. Excellent doesn't mean just for the best students. It means excellent. That people will make sacrifices for something that they think really is a good product. I'm not sure that everyone is convinced that the results are worth the investment, and that's a terrible thing. You have to get your game together. You cannot just expect people and their goodwill to support something where they don't really see results. One of the things that I've thought about a long time is that there's very little research in terms of graduates of day schools. There's very little attention paid to when students have finished school and they're 5 years out, 10 years out, etc. What do we see? What patterns do we see? Now, granted, there are many, many variables, but as in any kind of successful organization, you have to be able to try to see your results, evaluate them, and then tweak whatever it is that you're doing in order to make it better. If we're just assuming, well, I think I know what's best for my students, and we're just going to do the same thing that we've done for 25 years, well, that doesn't work in the business world. Why should that work necessarily in the educational world, particularly if you're competing for the philanthropic dollar? If you want people to invest in you, you have to demonstrate that your business plan and that the way you go about doing things is really excellent and really the best.